If everybody could grab a seat, that's going to be sticking around for our economic panel here. Sorry you got to hear my voice again, but honestly, this will be the last panel. I'm going to hand over duties on the security panel to my colleague, Kath Hicks, who runs the International Security Program here at CSIS. So a great opening, I think, providing some high-level vision. What was the relationship like really at the beginnings post-nuclear test, and what are some of the ideological reasons that really brought the two countries together? But there are two different paths, I think, that sometimes crisscross when we take a look at the economic relationship versus the defense and security relationship. Sometimes the econ relationship is really the positive driver, and I think back to Y2K and the growth of IT services and the telecom boom and other areas. And there are times that the defense and security relationship really kind of take the lead and provide a stronger leg. Probably there's been a few moments when both have been strong, although we tend to think back to when one or the other was relatively weak. I think today you might say that it's a bit more in the latter camp where you look at some of the things Ambassador Wisner had articulated. India is a currency manipulator. The new WTO consultations we've requested, some of the trade issues of the United States, looking at increasing customs duties, and I think overall, at least from Washington's perspective, probably a bit more negative than positive right now. But at the same time, there's extremely notable exceptions to that. You see Saudi Aramco and a $20 billion investment. You see Walmart's acquisition of Flipkart. So you see some of the biggest investments that India's ever seen taking place in a relatively short period of time now. So, Washington sometimes, while the perceptions from this town can be fairly negative, you look out in the real world and you see real companies and they're doing really big things. So we've got three terrific panelists that are going to help us chart out what's real, what's fake, and most likely it's always a bit of both. I think overall, you look at the relationship today on the economic side, and you could say, well, maybe it's directionless, maybe everybody's kind of moving in their own space, or that it's multi-directional. That there is a lot of movement happening, although there's nobody that's really trying to manage that process. A little bit like a symphony without a conductor. Is there something that can happen from Washington that would help to add a bit of impetus behind the economic relationship? Certainly ironing out the concerns that are there, and there's a lot, but is there something positive and proactive that can be done that would help to give us a bit of vision on where the economic relationship can be headed in the future? I have three terrific panelists, as I mentioned, all of whom I've had the great experience of working with for many years over my journey in learning about India. First, immediately to my left, is Ambassador Susan Esserman, who leads the international trade practice at the law firm of Steptoe & Johnson. Sue had been Deputy U.S. Trade Representative covering India and some of the other really tough markets, never given the easy jobs during her periods inside government, and had been Assistant Secretary of Commerce prior to that. And as I like to say, when I first joined USIBC back in 1998, Sue was one of the relatively few people those early years in senior levels of the U.S. government that would actually return a phone call from the U.S.-India Business Council. So a lot of our insights and interest, and you probably keynoted every single event we had, because that was how it went back in those days. So, and we like to joke now, there's too many dialogues and too much this and too much that. Sue will have some terrific insights when you didn't have those things and how different was life back in those days. Next to her is Sadanand Dume. Sadanand is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. And also, for those of us kind of in the policy sphere, he's a member of the coolest fraternity that's out there as a former correspondent for the Far Eastern Economic Review. That's a clique that outsiders look at, and how can you ever break into that? A great fraternity from those that were covering Asia before Asia really kind of bloomed for a lot of us here in Washington. And to Sadanand's left is Arun Kumar. Arun, I got to know him when he was a board member at the U.S.-India Business Council running KPMG's West Coast operations, then joined the U.S. administration and the Obama administration as Assistant Secretary of Commerce, and really leading the charge and trying to lift up the economic relationship with India into a new trajectory, grabbing the CEO forum and building the commercial dialogue into the strategic. So some phenomenal efforts there. And then moving back to Mumbai, traveled the furthest for this event. Ambassador Sobhan, probably a tie there from India and Bangladesh, but traveling the furthest to come out for this event. So thanks, Arun, for doing that. Part of this was brainchilded at your home in Mumbai a few months ago. So thanks again for doing that. First, Ambassador Esserman, when there wasn't much of a relationship to speak of, look forward to hearing your impressions.
Thank you, Rick. And I really appreciate the focus of this program, because while we have not yet come close to realizing the full potential of the U.S.-India economic and trade relationship, it is really worth a look back at our relationship 20 years ago to see how far we really have come. In 1999, remember that India's GDP was $450 billion and its per capita income was $438, a per capita income less than Haiti and half of China's, which was before China's growth spurt. Although India was a founding member of the GATT, most people forget that, the GATT, the predecessor to the World Trade Organization, the economic reforms of the 1990s marked the first meaningful steps toward trade liberalization. So in 1999, when I entered the scene, there were still very heavy trade restrictions with import bans, quotas, and import licensing restricting a wide array of goods. India's tariffs were still among the highest in the world, with an average applied tariff rate of 34%, average total bound, that's the legal WTO rate, of 48.5%, with average bound agricultural tariffs of 113%. So it was really a partially closed economy at that point. And India was not on the radar screen of many American businesses. In fact, when you would call the US IBC meetings, there were very few people who would come. India at that time, as we heard, remained subject to economic sanctions that the US imposed following the 1998 bomb tests. And although a number of the sanctions were lifted quite quickly within 6 months of their announcement, such as the prohibitions on Exim and OPIC projects, export controls and prohibitions on the sale of military equipment remained, and there was, the whole atmosphere, as we heard earlier, was affected. As you might expect under these circumstances, our bilateral trade in goods and services was really minimal at $16 billion in 1999, a fraction of what it is today. One thing that I saw was that a number of US decisions that had been made in the decade before with respect to India, for example, routinely denying duty-free GSP treatment for India on certain products, those were really the carryover from an earlier era when there were few champions inside or outside government for India. So in the 90s, India was the target of two of the largest and earliest WTO cases that the US government filed, and we were successful then in challenging India for not establishing and implementing an adequate patent regime, and also for not eliminating quantitative restraints, essentially bans in these cases, on over 1,400 products covering the most basic of goods, including meats, fruits, textile, spices, and motor vehicles. We effectively had no bilateral trade relationship and no formal mechanism for dialogue. So keep in mind at that time, the intense focus of the US government and the business community was on efforts to bring China into the WTO, and India was very much to the side. And interestingly, our engagement with India was entirely in the context of the World Trade Organization, where India was leading the charge on behalf of developing countries in developing a development agenda that seemingly had almost nothing in common or was largely opposed to what the US agenda was in the WTO. But even in the context of the WTO, we could see then the potential for commonality of interests in the trade sphere based on India's emerging services, especially the IT sector, the rising entrepreneurial spirit, the bridge of the Indian American community, and of course, the foundation for our common democratic heritage. Interestingly, it was quite interesting, the Prime Minister Vajpayee's office signaled an interest in working with the Clinton administration on trade issues. In fact, in October of 1999, I was the first senior economic official to travel to India after its testing of the bomb. And I carried with me a letter from President Clinton for Prime Minister Vajpayee. And on that visit and through the end of the year, we negotiated 5 bilateral trade agreements. But, and one was actually quite a landmark agreement. It was the one resolving the big WTO challenge, and it ended up opening the Indian market to 1,400 goods. Again, some of the most basic consumer goods, from autos to cosmetics to chemicals. The then Commerce Minister, though, was very, very concerned that if we announced all of the agreements at once, it would really cause an uproar in India. So he demanded that we announce these agreements over the period of a year, that we sequence them, and out of respect and in the interests of the longer-term relationship, we did. We announced them over a period of a year. And also during this period, as we are trying to forge this new relationship, we had the Commerce Minister going down to the floor of the Parliament every week, sometimes daily, denouncing the WTO and denouncing the US. So you had to have a broader vision to see how we were going to develop a relationship. And in spite of all of this, we really saw promise lurking underneath the antagonism and the rhetoric. We were buoyed by President Clinton's historic visit, his affinity for the country, and his vision for the future of our partnership. We then saw in India a glimmer of what the partnership really could be in the 20th century, one characterized by almost unlimited potential for growth, a rising class of consumers, boosted by the creative Indian American community, a commitment to the rule of law, and of course, all grounded by our common democratic heritage. While we did have very high hopes for the Indian partnership at this point, I don't think we could have possibly imagined the transformation that actually took place that you heard about in the earlier session. The transformation on the security and the political relationship, the people-to-people connections, and the business-to-business ties, with now India, instead of being to the side, being a key part of companies' global strategy. And you heard some of the examples of that. I'm not going to focus on the broader economic changes in the relationship and leave it to our 2 panelists. I want to focus more on the trade side. So fast forward to today, the bilateral investment relationship is booming. The significant rise in US investment is due not only to the dramatic growth in India, the rising middle class, but also because of a conscious political decision beginning early in the UPA government to promote investment, and more recently the unambiguous embrace by Prime Minister Modi of foreign investment as a critical component of his economic strategy. So while on the investment side there is more room for growth, for sure, particularly as India engages in domestic reforms, land reform, labor, infrastructure, and other initiatives. It is interesting, though, that the Indian government has removed a number of restrictions on investment, and that augurs well for the future of investment trends. On the other hand, to be direct, the trade relationship is just less robust. And while two-way trade has increased more than 8-fold since 1999, it really has increased from a very small base, and today India's trade is still less than 1/5 of our trade with China, and it really shouldn't be that way. On the positive side, as you heard earlier from Ambassador Wisner, there were significant economic reforms that took place over the last 20 years. Also, India, for a period of time, about 10 years during this period that we're looking at, engaged in unilateral, successive trade liberalization. And while this year's budget, they did the same in certain areas, it is concerning to see that the Indian government has made the decision to increase tariffs. Actually, it was interesting to me because the products in which they're increasing tariffs seem to match the products that were the subject of our WTO case many, many years ago. But the reality is tariff and non-tariff barriers remain in place today that hold back the relationship, notwithstanding the unbelievable growth in business-to-business ties. And so on the strategic side, we've seen the Civ Nuke deal, the work on the Paris Climate Agreement, and the joint defense exercises as big strategic initiatives. We have seen nothing like that on the trade side. Our trade relationship has lagged and not kept pace with the broader strategic and political relationship, and is really not served adequately to advance our trade potential. So, going forward, we should be developing a much more forward-looking and more systemic engagement on the trade front. We should not let the growing list of bilateral trade issues and trade irritants limit our vision or our ambition. With two large dynamic economies, you do expect to see trade disputes, trade issues. Just ask the Europeans. We should not limit our bilateral dialogue to a discussion of these issues, and that's not to say that resolving these issues aren't important. We should work very hard to try to resolve these issues, and that should be a critical metric of the success of our bilateral engagement, but we should not limit our relationship to that. So, and nor should we identify our goals in a zero-sum manner. And here I am quite concerned that the reduction of the trade deficit seems to be the primary metric of both governments at this stage, both President Trump and the Modi government as a measure of success of a trade policy. Of course, one country's surplus is another's deficit, and adopting trade restrictions to promote domestic manufacturing implies that one country can succeed only at the expense of another, and I certainly don't think that is the case for our two countries. And now I'm going to echo a little about a bit of what Frank Wisner said earlier. We should not let our fear of competition or competitors, such as China, discourage us from moving forward aggressively to set new rules and stake a claim in the trade of the future. The alternative would be to cede the ground to that competition. Instead, we need to define a broader agenda that builds on the growing areas of mutual interest and advantage, draws on our points of commonality, our shared values, and our recognition that each country's future economic success is tied to the others. We need to explore ways in which the US and India can make a contribution in this common space. And here, I think Frank and I are thinking the same way. The idea would be relating to innovation and the knowledge economy, encompassing the internet, e-commerce, AI, blockchain, and other new sectors in a way that better positions US and Indian workers and companies for the economy of the future. It is this type of affirmative, forward-looking, and overarching approach to our trade and economic dialogue that can lay the foundation for a much more healthy bilateral relationship.
Oh, great. That was some great thoughts, Sue. Looking back at the past and what things were like back in the day, a different set of problems in terms of the amount of dialogue and attention that what we see right now. Sadanand, I mean, as one of the top followers of the Indian economy, great to get your perspectives. Where are we at? Things that we're missing, things that we should be doing, things that we're getting right. I mean, please, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks for having me over here. And it's great to be at CSIS and great to see so many friends and familiar faces in the audience. This is the 20th anniversary of the nuclear test, but it's also the almost exactly the 4th anniversary of since the election of Narendra Modi. And so what I'm going to do is use this opportunity to kind of step back and assess what I see as the limits of what is possible and what is not possible. But before I do that, let me just kind of, do a little bit of what Susan did also and kind of take a snapshot of where we were and where we are today. And one of the things that's very common if you work in the India space is to hear people complaining about just how slowly things move. And especially those who sort of, track things on a quarterly basis or it's just sort of, well, where are we now? Well, we're exactly where we were 3 months ago or 6 months ago or a year ago. Right. But in fact, if you step back and take the longer view, and I think that's one of the things that's valuable about this particular conference, things do move. So for example, in the year 2000, the trade ties between India and the US were $19 billion. Now they're 115 billion. It's true that 115 billion is still not such a high number, but that's what US-China trade was in 2000. So there has clearly been great growth. Obviously, there's potential for there to be more growth. In the year 2000, India was not one of America's top 25 trading partners in goods. Now it's broken into the top 10. Who would have thought that India would be one of the top 10 trading partners back in the time when you were talking about? So there has been change both in terms of absolute volumes, but also in terms of India's relative importance. It has, in fact, grown there too. If you look, for example, at H-1B visas in 1998, and this was already, Y2K and all of that was already about to begin. The U.S. issued 40,000 H-1B visas to Indian nationals. Last year, it was 129,000. So that's kind of more than tripled. So you do see this sort of, when you step back and take the longer term view, you do see fairly substantive change. Now to get to the sort of bulk of my comments, when I think of the U.S.-India economic relationship, I tend to think of it in two parts. The first, of course, is the bilateral economic relationship, or the all-important question of almonds, as Ambassador Wisner pointed out. But there are all these other issues that we all sort of that Ambassador Esselman touched upon a bit, and I think we can get into more in the Q&A. But there's a basket of issues that are specifically about what are the things that government negotiators from the two countries speak about. What are the things that they are concerned with, the free trade agreement, the BIT, and so on. But there's another strand also, which is the state of India's economic reform program. As we all know in this room, until 1991, India was one of the most closed economies and one of the most autarkic countries outside the communist bloc. So this is a country which from 1947 to 1991 firmly turned its back on the global economic system, and since 1991 has been in the process of liberalizing, both in terms of opening itself up to trade and the international market, but also in terms of loosening the controls of the license permit Raj, which shackled domestic entrepreneurship. And for the US, I would argue that both of these strands are equally important, though very often the nature of the policymaking process is such that the first strand gets more attention than the second. So now when I divide this into those two, and if I step back and take stock of both of those strands, I would say on the bilateral side there are some reasons to be happy. You hear a lot of positive stories, especially on the business side, and this is something that Rick is very well aware of because he wear the second hat as a consultant. And it's often interesting to me when I meet with investors or people in companies, and they, generally speaking, tend to have a much sunnier outlook than pundits like me who are always complaining and always looking at the glass half full and always writing articles in the Wall Street Journal. How
good news doesn't sell stories, right?
About how nothing. Why can't they privatize Air India? And then you meet someone who's making widgets, and they're saying that, well, it's become a little bit easier for me to make widgets, and that's all I care about. So there's a lot that's positive on the company side. Rick had mentioned the Walmart acquisition of Flipkart. I think that's probably just the most dramatic example. But there are many other sort of smaller examples that do kind of add up to a positive story at the firm level. But at the same time, I think, and this is sort of where I agree with Ambassador Esselman, you have to step back and look at some of these perennial issues, right? We've been talking, for example, forget an FTA. I mean, we've been talking about the bit, the relatively low-hanging fruit of a bilateral investment treaty for years and years and years in this town. I mean, I've lost track.
2006.
Are we anywhere closer to a bit? And the honest answer is no. So let's just forget an FTA. We're not even close to the stepping stone to the FTA. The IPR issues aren't going to go away. Those who are in the weeds of this are sort of Section 3D. The ghost of Section 3D will always sort of, I fear it's going to be, lurk over us for the rest of our lives. You have price controls in India recently with high price controls on stents and other issues. And today especially, I would say that things are made even trickier because in both capitals you have a set of fundamental reassessments going on. As Ambassador Esselman mentioned, in the most recent Indian budget, you had the first rolling back really on the question of tariffs that we've seen since the advent of liberalization. Even the Manmohan Singh government, which in many ways went slow on reforms, did continue down the trade liberalization front. And now we see that tariffs are being raised again. India's bilateral investment treaties with other countries are being looked at, are being revisited, and so on. So there's certainly something that there's backward movement on some of those issues. And now, if I were to apply the same lens to the domestic reform program, which I follow much more closely, I think that it gives us a chance now to step back and see and assess really what we think is possible and what is not possible. And again, let me just, in the interest of balance, start with a look at what is positive and what has been achieved. FDI, for example, foreign direct investment, has been, this government has been extremely successful. Last year, it got $45 billion of investment of FDI, which is, I remember when I was a Far Eastern Economic Review correspondent in India, when the first BJP government was in power, the ambitious plan of the Vajpayee government was to triple FDI from 3 billion to 9 billion. And we were like, oh my God, how was that ever possible? And last year, India got 45 billion. Again, it sort of could be more, especially when you compare with China. But again, it's been sort of quite dramatic. The goods and services tax, many of us had been waiting for it for a long time. Again, you can quibble, and I am among those who has quibbled about the design of this particular GST. But on the whole, I think most fair-minded observers would concede that the very fact that a country of such size and such complexity has been able to put in place a GST, imperfect though it may be, still counts as a significant achievement, and over time that GST will likely be improved, simplified, and so on. Similarly, this government has put in place a bankruptcy bill, which India didn't have, that ought to make many things much easier, much more efficient, and so on. And it's also taken a more serious approach to non-performing assets in state-owned banks. One of the reasons that the non-performing assets look so much scarier now than they did some years ago, some years earlier, is that now the approach to them and the reporting of NPAs is more realistic and more honest than it was. So those are all in the positive side. And I would add to that a real emphasis on infrastructure. India recently electrified the last village that was not electrified. This doesn't mean all homes are electrified, but it means that now every single village in the country is electrified. Now you can argue that why did it take 70 years to get to this, but the fact is that it is nonetheless an achievement, and you can credit this government at the very least with completing that last mile of this journey. Similarly, there's a considerable push in terms of other infrastructure, including roads and so on. So now that we've got the good news out of the way, I do think that, I step back now and I look at, we've had 14 years, if you count the two UPA governments, right? We had, when Manmohan Singh came in 2004, and it was like, look, we've got Manmohan Singh and we've got his dream team of advisors, and now India is really going to hit the accelerator. This is when, reforms are about to take off. That didn't really happen. And then you get to 2009, and then it's like, well, now the communists are out of government. The communists are out of government, and the Congress has got 200 seats on its own. This time, all those reforms we've been waiting for are, well, it didn't really happen. And now we get Narendra Modi, the man from Gujarat. The Gujarat model, vibrant Gujarat, great economic administrator, and I must admit I'm one of the people who was saying all of these things. So there's a bit of a mea culpa over there. But 4 years later, where are we on privatization? Zilch. We have this sort of half-baked effort to privatize Air India that's going on, but they've put terms that are so stringent that nobody is interested in it. And other than that, we've seen nothing. There was great hope that because the BJP controls such a large chunk of the country, last I saw the BJP and its allies control about 64% of India in terms of population and more than half of the country in terms of GDP, including highly industrialized states such as Maharashtra and Gujarat. So there was certainly hope that they would use the fact that they control such a large chunk of the country to put in place reforms such as labor laws, which is we've been talking about for a long time. The importance of labor laws is that without labor flexibility, India is not going to be competitive in the kinds of manufacturing jobs that have helped China and Vietnam and other countries pull tens of millions of people or hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Ambassador Sobhan is over here, and Bangladesh is one of the world's great success stories in garments and textiles, and in fact exports more than India on this front. And of course I'm very happy for Bangladesh, but it is also a sign of how Indian politics, now across parties, has not been able to solve some of these problems. I'll just quickly hurry along. Similarly, there was a hope that this government would fix a deeply flawed land acquisition law that the last government had put in. The Columbia University economist Arvind Panagaria joked that it had made it harder to acquire land on India than on Mars. Well, it turns out it's still harder to acquire land in India for industry than on Mars. And on the question of so-called tax terrorism, the last government was criticized over and over for this very punitive tax system where the authorities were given far too much power. And my joke is that, the only difference in tax terrorism is that if the last government was the Al-Qaeda of tax terrorism, these guys are the Islamic State. So, that's all to say that when I look back now and we have these, 14 years in, does this mean that all of us in the Washington policy community should be more realistic on both these questions? The first is on how far we can drive the bilateral relationship. Do we keep pegging away in the hope that one day we will get to a bit, or do we just realize that, look, this is just not going to happen, and FTA is just not going to happen, let's look at plan B or plan C. And similarly, in terms of India's own reform journey, it's very interesting because if you look at the headline numbers, if you look at the GDP numbers, they look good. The World Bank says that India is going to grow at about 7.3% next year and 7.5% the year after that. If you take a longer term view, India has grown at over 6% for well over 30 years. So if you take the long view, you could argue, if you're an optimist, that look, things continue to improve, per capita income continues to rise and so on. But if you take a somewhat darker view, then you have to ask, at what point does the country begin to pay a price for the political system's inability to resolve some of these questions? Can India, forget achieve its potential, but can India provide employment to the 12 million people who come into the workforce every year if we take it for granted now that no government will be able to fix the labor law problem? No government will be able to get out of this land logjam we're in. And several other of these, tricky reforms that we've been talking for a while. I mean, we've been going back to when I was a correspondent. And I think that that's a conversation that we haven't yet had, because the conversation we've had so far has been driven mostly by the larger story about growth rates, by the story of India's post-1991 reform success, which is a genuine story. I'm not taking away from that. But the longer we wait and we are unable to tackle some of these serious reforms, I think it's about time to at least start having a conversation about what the possible implications of that are going to be. And on that uplifting note, I'm going to end.
Great. Well, Arun, I've asked you to provide a bit of the uplift too. Your vision on where the economic relationship may be headed. I mean, you tried to spark so many things during your time in the Obama administration, but I also remember about the time you were transitioning to Mumbai, another policy lead was moving from Mumbai back to DC in US government. And I just remember when he arrived, he said, why is everybody in this town so negative? There in Mumbai, there's deals, businesses are happening. So, both your time in Washington and Mumbai provide great perspective on, where is this going, where should it be going? So the floor is over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Great to be here. Nick gave me a really good excuse to come back and meet friends in Washington, D.C. And it's great to be on this panel. I think I can give you a bit of a field report, if you might. And, before I get into my report, a quick response to what Sadanand just said was I feel after going to India that it is not a country that's going to move in dramatic ways. Simply not. It's going to be an incremental approach. It's not going to suddenly one day create a big, we'll have all singing, all dancing, BIT or FTA. It won't. It might do it bit by bit, that's a pun by the way. It'll do it in its own way. So you've got to the way India works is incremental. And I've learned this in so many different ways. I recently served on a very important committee on corporate governance set up by the regulator. And in my conversations with many of the leading thinkers in India, private and public sector, I got to see how they think about progress. And I think there's something to that, because they know that to move things forward in a country like India, with multiple stakeholders, etc., you've always got to seek the art of the practical. What is that practical step forward? There is theory, and in India people understand theory just as well as anybody here does. But to get things done, there's that whole issue of how do you move things forward. And I do think things can and will move forward. The inexorable force of the growth of India is going to push a lot of things forward. So I just want to say that if you have expectations of big dramatic moves, I don't think India will provide big dramatic moves. Having said that, let me go into my field report. So I went back to India 15 months ago. In fact, I went, as some of you know, from this very town. And here, in my role in commerce, which Rick referred to, I had, opportunity for economic engagement around the world. And I could see there were three interesting areas, important areas for the U.S. to engage, to increase U.S. exports. And they were, in my view, India, ASEAN, and Sub-Saharan Africa. I think by and large, the first two still they stay the same. Sub-Saharan Africa has got some commodity price issues, etc., so it may not look as good as it looked at that point. But India definitely, I thought, had the highest upside. And within that, I looked at what areas would be interesting for engagement, and they were, one of the most important sectors was infrastructure, power, transportation, urbanization. Of course, that in my 15 months in India, those assumptions that I had when I was here at Commerce have been fully confirmed. I have not seen such demand, such attractive markets in any place except in Silicon Valley in the dot-com times. I mean, really, it is opportunity rich. It's full of opportunity. So this is the reality. You've got, the country is growing so fast, consumer demand is rising, infrastructure spend is increasing, and all that spawns a tremendous amount of demand. No wonder companies from around the world want to go into the US. No wonder FDI is increasing, because people see the demand. And the Walmart investment is a good example of perceiving where the demand is going. When I talk to the CEOs of consumer goods companies, they will tell me that that the unmet demand in India is like 5 times the demand they're actually meeting. So the upside is enormous, and that's going to be fueled by the rising incomes, the rising middle class, and also the rising movement to the cities from the villages. Not happening fast enough, but that is a phenomenon that's driving the growth of demand. Then we've had some interesting positive outcomes. We've had, Sadanand talked about the insolvency and bankruptcy code. That is actually a very big move. It means that the banks can now start dealing with their non-performing assets. We've already seen a dozen of them come, big ones come on the market. In my job leading KPMG, we work in a number of those areas, so I see that close at hand. So that is happening. Now, how quickly that happens again, we've got to see. The first steps are good, but there could be some meanderings along the way. But there is no question it's moving in one direction. The direction of travel is clear. It's in one way. It's going to be more upfront dealing with those kinds of issues. Once that makes progress, the banks will be able to lend more. The government plans to recapitalize public sector banks, which are dominant in the Indian financial scene. When that happens, private sector investment will pick up again. Right now, private sector investment is sitting on the sidelines. So these are the positive things that I see happening. The GST had some bumps along the road. So there were systems issues. There was a very complicated schema that was finally come up with. Again, it's a very typical Indian way of coming to a solution, that where you would like to get 1 or 2, you get a dozen different schemes. But you know what? That made it work. So in the GST, it's a constitutional innovation to get the federal government and state governments to sit together and figure out how to tax and distribute the collections. It's quite complex, and so you have this GST council with all the states involved, and they make a lot of the decisions. But that's happening, and it's moving forward. And I think the government took a lot of risk with the GST, because remember, a lot of informal commerce now becomes formal. It meant actually that small shopkeepers, etc., had more work to do, and so I'm very positive on where that's going. I see that the logistics has improved, trucks are moving faster, all that. Then there's tremendous energy around entrepreneurship. This is, in my view, new. I mean, I've been going to India for several years, but I haven't seen this before. In India, the culture was try to get a stable job. Your parents wanted you to get a stable job in a government or in a good company, so to speak. But today, the young people are like, let's start something. Let's be entrepreneurs. The government's own message is, we'll help you create jobs rather than we'll create jobs for you. So I think that narrative is a very interesting narrative. And in fact, when I talk to venture capitalists who invest in India, they tell me that after Silicon Valley, India is the best place in terms of deal flow and quality of opportunities. So that's a big thing. So I think overall, the India opportunity cannot be ignored, and it's not being ignored. Everybody knows the size of India, 1.25 billion citizens, middle class of 250 million people, increasing. I think little indications like the mobile phones, every month there are 5 million new subscribers. I mean, these are enormous numbers. I don't think it's always realized what the size of the economy is. So the Indian economy today is in dollar terms about 2.4 trillion. That's about the size of the UK economy. So think about the UK. The UK is a very big player in the US economy in terms of investment, in terms of bilateral trade. Well, that's where India has to get naturally by being a $2.4 trillion economy. If you look at it in PPP terms, clearly India is even bigger. So I think the underlying needs for greater trade and investment is very, very strong, and it's going to happen. Until some years ago, there were kind of misgivings on what economic beliefs were. Is India a communist country? Is it socialist? Is it not favoring capitalist, a capitalist approach? I think all that's pretty much gone. I mean, there's no discussions these days on these topics. And if I go ahead and have a meeting with any state chief minister in India, they will all talk about investment promotion, increasing trade. There's magnetic Maharashtra, vibrant Gujarat, something else Bengal, and on and on. Every state, Andhra, or every state wants to attract investment and global investment. So if you go to, and we work with a number of these states in my firm, so I go to many of these events, and it's great to see you go to Calcutta and Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee brings along a whole delegation from South Korea who make a commitment to invest in West Bengal. And it is just really uplifting to see this external orientation among the leadership of many of these states. So in all that context, it just has to be that the US-India trade and investment relationship has to grow. I mean, as India's economy grows, it just has to grow. As was mentioned, it is already among the top 10, but the question really is why isn't it in the top 4? It really should be China, Mexico, Canada, India. It should be right there, given the size of India's economy. So there's a lot more work to be done in that space. Now, I think it's also important that the way we look at India from the US vantage point is that I think it's really important to realize that we want to see India grow. It is manifestly in the interest of the United States that India grows. Because as India grows, the consumer demand, the demand for all kinds of things from India is going to help US companies, US exporters. It's going to create jobs in India, in the US. So I think this is not something that is really well understood. Often in our narrative, and it's not just today's narrative, it's been a narrative for quite a while, there's a sense that, this job is going to go from here to there. The fact is that as that economy grows, it'll create more jobs here, and vice versa. So I think, our leaders, political, business, everybody needs to understand that we have a great vested interest in the growth of both countries. I think this is one of the reasons why, in our previous administration, we really tried to put commerce and economics at the center of the relationship between the US and India. Strategic and commercial dialogue was a big step forward to acknowledge that's got to be at the center. Nobody felt that would solve all the various issues that you will have, but it was important that it was seen that the whole economic engagement has strategic implications for both countries. Now, in terms of looking at how we can work together, add various thoughts, but I just thought that I would start with laying out what I see in India. What I see in India is things are happening, it's growing. It's not a perfect situation. We've got situations, there's rural poverty. It's a mixed scene. So there's some states that are growing double digits. Some states are growing at the rate that China used to grow in its heyday. Other states clearly that are far below. So it's a mixed picture. But the overall picture, I would say, is very positive and it's on a strong upward trend.
Yeah, well, great, Arun. Thanks for that. Yeah, there's some, I think, specific dynamics back in '98 that I saw that I think, surprisingly, they're gone and hardly people talk about them anymore. Seeing previous prime ministers, when they would come to the United States and want to engage the business community, it would be a private, secret meeting that nobody would know about. Whereas, Prime Minister Modi openly embraces, and the blowback that you hear from India is not too strong, even from the opposition for doing that.
One thing I wanted to make a point that I think Suthanand made was about when you look at these long spans of time that you see progress. So I was in Davos, and the Prime Minister had hosted a dinner for a whole bunch of global CEOs, and in chatting with them just before the dinner, we were waiting for the Prime Minister. Many of them said that when you look at this overall span of time, they do see clear progress. So if you look at month to month or year to year, more difficult, but these folks have been there trying to engage with India for a long time, and they all seem that they could see a positive trend. So.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the areas that in the Trump administration on the India economic has kind of caught the strategic interest is looking at trilateral, quadrilateral, that kind of. There are actually meetings happening in town today on U.S., Japan, India cooperation on infrastructure, things like that. I I wonder, I think especially for Arun and for Sue, having spent time inside government and outside, it's one thing to have a multilateral framework like the World Trade Organization, but when you start talking about a few partners and players, and it's going to result, for instance, in infrastructure where you're going to want your companies to win, is it a good idea that in practice our companies are going to compete and there's going to generate maybe more tension? Or are there scope and opportunities when you talk about trilateral, quadrilateral, things like that? Is there actually scope for cooperation in those spaces? Arun, maybe I'll start with you. I mean, is there space or is there going to be an inherent competition if we go down those pathways?
No, I think there is space. I think quadrilateral or trilateral cooperation, if you can expand the opportunity landscape and can get more companies from the various trilateral or quadrilateral countries involved, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I actually think that it's important to do that because in some sense it would be an energizing response to what's happening with the Bridge and Road Initiative. Which also means, which is not to say that companies from the US or India should not participate in BRI. I think companies should participate in BRI. So I'm not necessarily seeing it as totally competitive, but I think it would be valuable to have another energizing initiative that brings countries together. So one of the issues in connectivity and infrastructure is that it's not easy to win big projects acting singly as individual companies. I mean, what does China do? They go into Africa, they say, okay, we'll build out a corridor from city A to city B, and we will bring everything. So they take a consortium approach, including the financing. I think our economies, India, US, Japan, etc., don't work that way, but it's important to find some construct whereby we can begin to group, create consortia, and along with support from agencies like JICA or TDA, take on some of these projects. I think that there are big opportunities for companies from all these countries by doing that. So I really feel it's good. I feel any coalition that tries to expand the economic part, I think is good.
Yeah. Sue, I don't know if you have it.
I know Arun has given a great deal of thought to this, and you thought about it a lot when you were in government, and I would just say from a strategic standpoint, especially what's going on with Belt and Road, I do think it is really incumbent on us to look at other vehicles for ensuring that there are the right rules of the road, looking strategically, and having broader participation of other Asian powers in the region. So I think it's very, very important to do. I think it's very complex, though. And the real complexity is how do you structure something so that companies from each of the countries feel that they have a fair or better shake than they would have had if we were going it alone. And so I think it's really important given the current competitive environment, but I think this is going to be a very complicated, delicate exercise.
I think one area, I guess, that I did see where it would be helpful, we talk about, and this is a question I'm going to put over to Sadanand too, similar to the one that I asked Ambassador Wisner about, is there really a dead zone on reform? But you look at it a different way. Some of our partners we're talking about in trilateral and quadrilateral were actually complaining at the end of the Obama administration because in the effort to try to get all of our agreements across the finish line before they left office, we were jamming the phone lines of almost every action officer in the entire government of India. So a lot of our other partners couldn't get phone calls returned, couldn't get actions initiated on the Indian side because we were just like the sprint to the end of the marathon there at the end of the 8-year term there. So, if we can shed a little bit of light and use in some of our partners in those moments too. But Sadanand, let me ask you that question. I mean, what do you think about that? With the elections coming up a year away from now, some key state elections, do you think that it limits on what the Modi government can do in terms of some of the issues that we have on our agenda? Is economic reform, mostly out of the political sphere? Is there scope? Is there hope?
I mean, I think it definitely does. I agree with Ambassador Wisner, and I don't think that's particularly a comment on this government. It's just that it's the nature of politics. It's the nature of politics in many places. It's certainly the nature of politics in India. I mean, you have a reform tracker with the 30 major reforms, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the last major reform was more than a year ago, about a year ago, June 2017 or so on your
GST, July.
GST,
yeah.
right.
Yep.
So that's almost a year ago. And so now we're heading into a national election. And I actually have a slight disagreement with Arun on this question of the kinds of conversations we have about economics and economic policies in India. While it's certainly true that politicians of all hues have got the memo about investment, they've understood that guy comes, builds a factory, that means jobs and potentially votes. No problem. It could be Mamta, it could be you name it. They're not all equally good at executing, but they've understood that. But in other sort of fundamental ways, I think in many ways the debate is still on. So just recently I was watching a speech to the Bombay Stock Exchange by Mohan Bhagwat, the head of the RSS. And for those of you who speak Hindi, I would encourage you to watch that speech. It's just fascinating. It was a 55-minute speech. And first of all, here you have the head of the RSS speaking to the Bombay Stock Exchange. Talk about something incongruous to begin with. And then that entire speech was really an attempt to massage spiritual ideas into something approaching an economic philosophy. And it was really interesting to watch. But the point I'm trying to make over here is that some of these questions have not been settled. The fact that we had demonetization in 2016, which I think is one of the most harebrained things that any government of India or any government anywhere has done, I call it too crazy for Venezuela, to me that was mind-blowing. And the only people, and of course after the fact we had various people, most of them affiliated with the government in some way, justifying this policy somehow. But before the fact, the only people who had recommended this kind of crazy scheme were people from some small, obscure NGOs or some one NGO in Pune, and people who are kind of broadly part of this RSS family. And I don't want to overstate it. I think clearly India has moved way more towards markets and towards a kind of contemporary understanding of free enterprise between 1991 and now, no question about it. But I think that we should not forget that there are still live debates within the kind of the family of the BJP about very fundamental things. Do markets work? Can the private sector run an airline better than the public sector? These remain very sort of live and open. My last point on the sort of question of why things are closed or why we're unlikely to see much reform in the run-up to the election is that all of the attacks on Modi on economic issues come from his left. No politician goes out there and says, hey, you haven't liberalized fast enough. The politicians all go out there and say, oh, you're a crook and you're in the pocket of the rich guys. That's the only language of politics across parties. And that means necessarily that heading into a national election, you have to be careful. I don't blame the government for being careful running leading up to a national election.
Yeah. Well, Arun and Sadana, I'll throw this one to both of you. Both of you had mentioned, at least briefly, the rural regional parties, and especially Arun. I mean, with every state to West Bengal now having investor roadshows, which I think had been inconceivable. Maybe even a little bit more believable when the communists were running the state at the end, when Buddha was fairly reform-minded. But how is this experiment in center-state relations and trying to alter the dynamic there, where the center, from the Planning Commission and Niti Aayog and offering model rules and regulations and that kind of stuff, how is that working? Do you feel that states have more tools at their disposal, that they're getting stronger cooperation, even non-BJP states? Is it sustainable? Is it a flash in the pan? How would you judge center-state ties and using that to try to leverage India as a better investment destination?
Well, I won't go into center-state ties aspect. Maybe Sadan can do that. But among the states, I'm really encouraged to see the sense of competition. So I've been with chief ministers in so many different states, ranging from Kerala, which is a communist government, where he's very, very keen on promoting investment, promoting entrepreneurship, to Punjab, which is a Congress government. And
India is the one place where communists aren't always the furthest left on the spectrum.
but the spectrum, or if it's in Bengal, to very dynamic chief minister of Maharashtra. So you see all these states with very different political parties, but in terms of promoting investment, promoting employment, promoting economic dynamism in general, I think they're all on the same. Or Chief Naidu in Andhra. So you have about half a dozen to 10 very dynamic chief ministers who are very, very keen, and they feel that that's what they can do for their people, and that's what's going to get them elected. So they definitely believe that. As a result of that, they take best practices from each other. They each are creating various ways of increasing the ease of doing business through single window approval mechanisms or various pieces of legislation, sometimes punishing officials who sit on files. I mean, the whole spectrum of tools that are coming out in these different states. So I would say that I do see a certain degree of energy in that space. I don't know, to some extent competitive, but to some extent that's where they are. They want to lift up their states.
So, as with most things, there's a glass half full and a glass half empty way of looking at this. And obviously, from an investor perspective, it's been great that you have this state level competition, and that I have Maharashtra competing with Gujarat and so on. But if you kind of step back and look at the politics, a couple of things are I think potentially troubling. For instance, in the Karnataka election that we just saw, we have the results out tomorrow. One of the things that came out very strongly was this sense of sub-regionalism. And if you look at what's happened take the longer term over the last 25 years, as you're well aware, Rick, some states have done much, much better than others. And the problem we have really is that, yes, it's true that Maharashtra has run with the opportunity, as has Gujarat, as has Tamil Nadu, but by and large, these are the states in the south and the west. There was a time when it looked like Bihar was getting its act together and so on, but by and large, at the risk of sort of overgeneralizing, the problem is that the most populous parts of India are also the parts that have not got their act together. And occasionally one sees glimmers of hope in places like Bihar and UP. But the fact is that if you just look at per capita incomes, the per capita incomes between the divergence between the rich coastal states and the inland highly populous states is growing enormously, in part because birth rates are much higher in the Hindi heartland, but also in part because incomes have grown much faster in the coastal states because they attract that much more investment. I mean, of course, there are a few states in the north that are an exception to this, such as Haryana, but by and large, this holds. And I think the interesting question in terms of federalism is, and I think so far India has managed this quite well, but how do you allow this, because it's very good for the country as a whole, but at the same time, do you have systems in place that contain some of the tensions that arise, for instance, from migration?
Yeah, one of the more fascinating reports that just got released last week, if you haven't seen, the state of Rajasthan actually requested the World Bank to come in and kind of do a self-assessment of governance, reforms, economic growth in their own state, which is pretty unusual because sometimes state leaders, they're not often challenged when they try to put forward data and statistics and information about their own state. So, Rajasthan actually kind of took that step. So you see, even apart from the tools that the Indian federal government's offering, there you got an opportunity where a state was reaching out, beyond for a multilateral agency to come and take a look. The last thing before I open it up to the floor, and this would be for Sue and Arun primarily, here we are in Washington, we got these trade concerns, and you see, as Ambassador Wisner had mentioned, using tools once again of the government, threat of sanctions, GSP revocation, things like that, to try to resolve issues on price controls and disputes. Both of you, having spent time inside and outside of government, do you have any advice for those in the Washington community that these are real issues, and you want to see them resolved, but also you want to make sure that the relationship itself doesn't fall into an abyss? What's the best way to kind of approach that you've seen so far Is it pressure and threats? Is it coaxing? What are some things that we should keep in mind, since you both have that unique perspective of having been inside negotiating these things as well as outside in the private sector? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think there are a combination of approaches, and some it depends on the issues. I know there's just an outcry about the number of big trade issues that we have today. First, I think it's important to say relative to what countries. I mean, India, I'm sorry to say it that way, but that is how we need to look at things, because today we have a very different trade environment in our government, and they're the first to say it. But for each of these issues, there's a different approach. And in many of them, they look very inflammatory, but they're actually not. And in those kinds of cases, even on the currency issue, it's a technical qualification. I think the important thing is that there are channels in place for engagement, and on the Indian side, they should be engaging on this so they can head off anything difficult that could happen. I think the GSP is really sad. That's something I deeply regret, because I assume the idea is that they think this is leverage to open India's market. I don't think it will serve that way with India. And number two, I think GSP actually still serves an important development purpose and helps. There are many poor people in India that actually benefit from the preferential treatment that India gets in the United States. So, and on that issue, I think some of those are the hardest, because the Indian government has a lot of pride about these kinds of issues, yet it's very, very important. And the question is, who cares enough to take up an issue like that could have a broader effect on disputes? Two countries that are large are going to have disputes, WTO disputes. The question there is, how do we deal with them? Is there a way that we can set up that with better lines of communication, which there are today on the trade side, that perhaps in discussion we could look at other ways of achieving the same goal, that we don't always fire first. I think each of these issues require a different kind of approach, and there are ways to manage and redirect some of the issues. I think there are two areas that I'd like to raise. One is how you work with government to think strategically, because an agency like USTR has 300 people. They are, and especially now with the most intense agenda in history, which they themselves have created, how do you get thinking that is strategic, that is something other than just quenching a fire? So I think that's a problem. And I don't know what you found, Arun, is sometimes the government is good, the all government approach, where you bring the relevant agencies together and they really work collaboratively in a strategic way. I find sometimes that's really hard to get people on board, and that's where I do think the private sector really needs to work with governments strategically, because governments are not our government as it's currently structured, given the resources that are available, and to me, regrettably, the outsourcing that goes on, they are not in a position to look forward down the road.
Yeah. Arun?
No, I would agree with everything, Sue, that you said. And even the examples you gave, GST, I think is a great example for two reasons. One is, if our premise is that India's growth is good for the growth of the US, growth in India will create jobs not only there but also in the US, then GST is a good example of going the other way. The second is, there's this Indian author named Devdutt Patnaik who talks about how Indians look at things and how Westerners look at things. And one of the things is this: you cannot ever tell an Indian what to do. You can't say, don't do this.
Right.
Even if he doesn't want to do it, he won't want to take that injunction. So there's a way of dealing with these situations that's very different. I want to build on what you said about what the government can do. I think one of the strong roles that the government can do is the convening role. For me, the first time I came to government was the 3 years I spent here, and I was quite amazed at the power of convening.
Right.
I think convening influencers, either through the CEO forums or there's also the President's Advisory Council in Africa. There were many, many mechanisms that I remember that I thought were really effective. They didn't negotiate or decide anything, but they helped thinking move in directions, helped shape priorities for governments. So I thought using the convening power, and I think I believe now the US-India CEO Forum is being revived, which is great to hear. I think those are important forums.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let me open it up to the floor. What questions do you have for the econ panel here? Got about 15 minutes. Yeah, Nelson up in the front row can get it kicked off. Great. We got a microphone coming up here, just so everybody can hear in the back. Thanks.
Rick, thanks so much. This afternoon's panel is just absolutely terrific. Afternoon's program is absolutely terrific, and this panel is great. Ambassador Juster in mid-January gave his inaugural speech in which he laid out a vision for US and India. And I must say, India is so lucky to have Ambassador Juster there at this moment. And as much as I respected what he laid out, I disagreed with him on one point. His view is that we have moved past the point where US and India need a frame for their relationship. I disagree with that, as I told him when I was in India last month at the India-US Forum. I think that India, especially in the commercial side, benefits hugely from a frame with the US. Commerce, as Arun points out, commerce is moving. I think commerce needs the encouragement of a framework between the US and India that both sides can hook onto to drive toward further commercial opening. And I wonder what this panel would think about the notion that indeed, while in the last administration we looked at multilateral efforts to open up India, APEC, perhaps looking forward at engaging India with its Pacific allies, perhaps even the TPP. With this administration here, perhaps trying to find a strictly bilateral, perhaps commercial light framework would at least drive us forward and give Trump and Modi benchmarks against which to measure the relationship and give companies on both sides the encouragement to drive forward.
Sue?
I completely agree with you, Nelson. It is what I was really talking about, because in the absence of that, you fall backward. And people then get more exercised rather than being constructive about dealing with the existing issues. And so, I also noted in that speech, he talked about that he did talk about a free trade agreement too eventually. And I feel like we need to not get stuck in old structures. Remember, the whole FDA was developed many years ago, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. Just like, I don't think that's the way we ought to be thinking about. We ought to look at something that is achievable. And FTA is not. It actually, and it's a gold standard that's inapplicable to India and the United States, because what does it do? It makes each country immediately defensive, because we know what the first demand will be, agriculture. India is not capable of delivering an FTA-style agriculture sectoral agreement. That's part of an FTA. And you know what their first demand will be for us, visas. And so it seems like beating our head against the wall to go and use the old structures. So, but that doesn't mean there shouldn't be a structure. And that's why I do think something where we're both confident, not defensive, but where we can really set the rules of the road and potentially expand to other partners like in the innovation area.
Yeah. Son, Arun, anything to
I'll
add?
take a very quick stab at this. I think that all of us would probably be in agreement, all of us on this stage and many of us in the audience. But I think that, we sometimes lose sight of the fact that we are really in an extraordinary moment of history. I never thought I'd see the day where there'd be a US administration where people don't seem to think that trade itself is such a good thing. That comparative advantage is something that's being debated. So it's so fundamental and so basic. I think it's less talk actually on the Indian side, but you have seen over the last few years, for example, some backsliding in terms of bits, some concerns that India actually did not do the right thing by opening up and so on. So while I think we agree on the goal, I think we have to acknowledge that where we sit today, that goal seems to have receded rather than come closer compared to just a few years ago.
Yeah, and I do agree that there needs to be a mechanism for robust dialogue where you can have a lot of trust building occur. And there are some issues where there is a lot of mistrust. I mean, visas, equalization on the Indian side, these are big issues. And there needs to be some way in which there's commitment on both sides to work through issues on either side. And if you don't have that conversation, I think then it almost becomes a feeling of, you don't really care for what we care about. So it's really very, very, very important to engage at high levels and constantly.
I think that's one thing I've seen that kind of is missing, the Vajpayee government had and successive governments have not. The ability to stage and offer a schedule and timeline for tough decisions. Sue, you mentioned one, but also, for Yashwant Sinha as finance minister to announce they're going to go to East Asian tariff levels over 5 years, and every year it would drop. Or opening telecom, where they said this is the roadmap, and they actually went faster than they laid out for the roadmap for opening telecom. That kind of idea about coming to an agreement, even if you delay tougher measures, but you knew they're going to stick to it. We have seen, even against stronger headwinds against foreign engagement. But Singh didn't have so much, and I think Modi too, the idea about setting a multi-year framework, that kind of thing. So there are models out there that have been employed by BJP governments in the past.
There are less dramatic things like, to get Indian companies into U.S. supply chains is an important issue. If India needs to increase exports, the best way is to integrate supply chains, which also means you should not have tariffs that militate against those supply chains. So many of these are interlinked, and I think an approach where you could get commercial sector companies involved with governments to focus on increasing supply chain integration would be a good thing for both countries. So the infrastructure is another area where you should get commerce, finance, companies, banks, financiers, and the governments together to focus on how can we look at a few major opportunities, maybe creating consortiums. I think there's a lot of room for that kind of engagement, and that can only happen if there's some kind of a mechanism whereby which there can be a good, strong government-to-government dialogue fairly frequently for these two big economies. I think, so you mentioned the deficit thing. It's, when you think about it, India's deficit with the US as a percentage of exports is shrinking. I mean, 30 billion is not a big deal for a 2.5 trillion economy or a, 15, $16 trillion economy.
It's also not a reflection of trade performance.
We just, but if you have these conversations, hopefully there'll be other narratives that come out of it.
Right.
We had another question up at the front here. The microphone, easy enough.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentations and discussion. My name is Paolo von Schirach. I'm president of the Global Policy Institute. Looking at the fundamentals, and you know this to a level of granularity that most people don't have, is fundamentally, as we look forward, the glass half full or half empty. If I look at the doing business rankings and I look where India is, it's not an overwhelmingly positive position. If I look at Transparency International Index on corruption perception, it's not particularly enticing. Mr. Modi came to power as a sort of this transforming hurricane, that he was going to do everything right and open up the country. FDI will come in, whatever, in rivers and whatnot. Just this week's Economist points out to a stalling of exports from India. You have discussed some issues, including this potential, cooperation with the World Bank in terms of looking at governance in one particular state, which I think is very intriguing. But where do you see this going? In other words, do you see the trend sufficiently up that is comforting in terms of creating the appropriate business climate for FDI and other economic activities, both domestically driven and driven by FDI? As an observer and looking at the world map, I am not overwhelmed. The question is, am I not seeing all the right signs that you've been appropriately discussing, or what is it that needs to be done, and if so, is it an urgent need, or is this, or we can say, oh, don't worry about it, we are on the right track, we'll get there. What is your take, if I may?
I think Washington's perspective, we're always going to say it's urgent need, so I think everybody agree with that one. But yeah, Sunana, do you want to take the first crack at that?
I mean, I think first of all, I don't think anybody was expecting, that any prime minister was going to come in and make ease of doing business. India wasn't going to be turned into Singapore, right, by anyone. So what you're looking at essentially are very low rankings, and what you're looking for is incremental change. Is it in the right direction? In terms of the ease of doing business rankings, in fact, it has been in the right direction. If you just look at the if you look at the numbers, but I would argue that enough hasn't been done, and I would argue that domestic investment. One of the reasons that domestic, and I'd love to hear Arun's point over here, but one of the reasons I think domestic investment has been suppressed. There's of course the so-called twin balance sheet problem, which is that banks had loaned too much and companies had overcapacity from the boom years, and so it doesn't make sense for them to be investing. But the sense I get, at least anecdotally, is also, and it comes back to this idea of working through very basic ideas, that the party and its core supporters, if they had to choose between two goals, between cracking down on crooks, as they see it, and generating wealth. If you had to pick between one of these two, I think there's a very large strand within the BJP and the RSS that would pick cracking down on so-called crooks. You've seen there was a Morgan Stanley report that came out not so long ago that India's seen quite a large flight of wealthy people, high net worth individuals, in the tens of thousands, and this is partly because they feel that, especially on the taxation front, the environment has been made less friendly. Now, of course, government supporters will say that this is all very good and that this is part of a cleanup and so on. But my own belief is that this government has acted as though the instrument that it is wielding is a flawless instrument. But in fact, I don't think that the tax service that Mr. Modi commands is the Danish tax service. And the real world consequences for the investment climate, I think, have been negative. So, it's a fantastic question, and I think that in many ways it comes down to, what do the people in a democracy want? And it seems to me that what he's done is, broadly speaking, the popular choice. I don't think this has been the correct choice. I think that we would probably have been better off, for instance, if he had decided that his number one priority, or first through fifth priority, was going to be job creation. There was a story, I don't know if you saw this the other day, there was a story about how there were, what was the number? It was a phenomenal number, something like 25 million people applied for 90,000 jobs in the railways.
Oh yes, I saw that.
And that that gives you that gives you a sense of the urgency that ought to be attached to the jobs question. This is not something that's been approached with that urgency, and so I certainly think that in terms of, we were never going to get you were never going to go from 130 in ease of doing business to 5. But I do think that this was an opportunity to move much faster, because this is the first single party government India has seen in 30 years. And the fact that the government has not been able to move faster, despite having the first single party majority in 30 years, despite having such a charismatic prime minister, does raise questions. And lastly, on one other point, is that Modi is an incredible communicator. I would say he's the best communicator by far in Indian politics. And the hope was, or at least my hope was, that he was going to use these great communication skills to sell tough reforms. So he'll take a reform that no one else could sell, and he'll take it to the people because he communicates so well. But in fact, what we're seeing is that he's using these great communication skills to talk up weak reforms and sort of project them as sort of earth-shattering and so on. So I certainly would say that on the whole, compared to what we could have got and should have got, they've fallen short.
Well, I would say that the foreign direct investment has been going up, and that in a way speaks for itself in terms of people voting with their checkbooks. On the corruption issue, that is, large country, that is an issue. But what I do hear consistently is that at the highest levels of government in the center, it's never been, this is the best it's ever been. A lot of people tell me there is no corruption at the highest levels of government, which I think is very, very refreshing to hear. So there are, it's obviously a mixed bag because it's a large country, but I think in the Modi government, one thing I've heard from a lot of folks is it's been the cleanest at the top levels.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, from Sadhana mentioned, we have our own kind of reform tracker, and looking at big domestic reforms and foreign equity reforms, I think Modi came out of the gate pretty effectively. Oil and gas, coal, a lot of big things early on. He moved about 40 FDI, some small, some big in the first 2 years in office, and then there's been a pretty steep decline. So in looking at it that way, maybe it's the lessons of the Vajpayee government. I know members of the Vajpayee cabinet had thought we did too much reform kind of mid-period, and sometimes those take a while to gestate, and sometimes there's a bit of short-term pain in that. So, it could be a thoughtful exercise of get some of those out of the gate pretty early and give them a little bit of time. But I guess some of this too, we'll only know if there's a second term and see if we see the same kind of thing rehash over another 5-year period. So, well, thanks to this terrific panel. I know the econ and trade side sometimes is a bit more depressing, but I think we got 3 terrific experts here to kind of walk us through. And coming up next, we'll talk a bit about the strategic relationship, which I think over the last 20 years has seen a little bit more of a direct upswing, chaired by Kath Hicks. But please join me in welcoming the 3 great panelists up here.